Today is going to be the last of my series on the 7 deadly sins. I'm going to talk on the deadly sin of lust. And I'm going to start today's talk with a little preamble, things we'll call administrative issues. So if avoiding the word fat was an issue, here we're talking in church about a topic generally considered verboten in church. So I won't be saying that little 3-letter word. Luckily for me, when I went to Google looking for options, there was a website that had 50 euphemisms for lusty exercise. We'll see how many I can use up by the end of the talk. Since I am speaking in church, I'm orienting my point of view for this talk using the Christian vantage point. But there's a very different view of lust as it's spoken of in the Old Testament, which is echoed by the words of Christ, and the view of the modern church, which is similar to how it's spoken of by the apostles, particularly Paul. In the modern church, what I mean by that is the church that developed after the death of Christ has a view of things that things of the flesh are the polar opposite of spirituality. Since marital relations are the very most fleshy and animalistic thing we can do, anytime we're engaged in such activity, or even thinking about or wanting to engage in such activity, this removes us from the divine. Since being closer to the divine is a good thing, then it follows that physical desire, and more so pleasures of the flesh, is always a bad thing. Less is better. And if one can manage to procreate without experiencing desire or pleasure, then the better for your soul. The Old Testament, on the other hand, positively extols the virtues of marital relations. Most everyone is at least somewhat familiar with Song of Songs or Song of Solomon and the protagonist's admiration of her ceiling rafters. Since the two views are radically different, and since my personal views are not at all aligned with the view of the modern church, I'm going to be talking about lust as it is spoken of in the Old Testament and how it is spoken of by Jesus. Also, I will note that lust is the desire, not the act itself, and that lust is not the same as being horny. Am I allowed to use that word? I'll use the horny goat. The horny goat, like hunger, is considered a drive, not an emotion. It's something driven by bodily needs. Lust involves someone else. You can feel the need alone. Lust isn't just the desire to shag, but the desire to be with that person. Lust has a target. Like emotional hunger, someone can feel lust even if their body is completely satisfied. And like emotional hunger, satisfying the body does not satisfy the mind or eliminate the need. So now the talk. Lust is my favorite sin. It was a bit of a contest. Sloth and gluttony were both contenders. The fact is, I like lust. It feels good. Most people find that lust feels good. The wonderful pull of desire, the heightened senses, the focus, the anticipation. But because it feels so good, it's an easy path to walk down. It isn't just that it feels good, it's that it feels right. And it isn't all that clear in the modern world just when and where lust becomes a sin. I mean, maybe the whole concept of lust as a sin is outdated. I have mentioned a few times that I believe the Bible does not label things as sin casually. And I will point out here that there is no reference in the Old Testament that condemns shaking sheets as a sin in and of itself. Nor is there any quote from Jesus making such a condemnation. In fact, in Matthew 19, Jesus says that a man and a woman shall marry and become one flesh. This page intentionally left blank. In Corinthians 7, Jesus instructs husbands and wives not to deprive one another of conjugal rights, specifically noting that wives also have a right to conjugal pleasures. But both in Jesus's words and many times in the Old Testament, it's clear that two-person push-ups are great when one is talking about the right time, right place, and right who, and very bad with the wrong person. Both the Old Testament and quotes from Jesus do condemn lust. And when they do, it is almost always connected with lusting after a particular sin, such as adultery. Lust is also used to refer to lusting after other things than a romp in the hay, especially lusting after false gods. But it is most often used to refer to desires of the flesh, which is the only use of it I'm going to be talking about here now. Like most of the deadly sins, there's some amount of the attribute that isn't a sin. But rising levels of intensity push into sin category. In general, the line where it becomes a problem is when it starts to do damage to the sinner or to the people around the sinner. And with lust in particular, it's when a line is crossed where one loses control. Bad decisions begin to be made, often resulting in someone doing something that they know is wrong and they know is likely to damage their life, and probably other lives too. But they just can't stop. While planting parsnips is not condemned in and of itself in the Old Testament, specific circumstances of rolling in the clover are highly condemned. It's not quite true that lust is not a sin if you don't commit the physical sin behind it. Jesus did say that if a man lusts after a married woman, he's committed a sin in his heart. But for the most part, lust is only a sin to the extent that you are lusting after sin. Even in Jesus's example here, he specifically specifies a man lusting after a married woman. Lust, like envy, can be dangerous in and of itself. It's kind of exciting, thrilling, and generally feels great to play with the edges of forbidden lust, convincing oneself that you won't cross that line. But I will point out here and again later that lust can have a particular quality where you suddenly find yourself on the far side, where the voices in your head telling you this is a bad idea are suddenly drowned out by the white noise drumming in your ears. While in very primitive conditions, the advantages of stronger lust are obvious, the development of human societies threw a huge monkey wrench into the works. Humans had to live in groups, cooperate with each other. Human males, like all mammalian males, came with the tendency to challenge and attack each other pre-installed. This needs to be kept in check enough to both hunt as a group and defend against outside males. Females need a high level of cooperation to raise young that are born helpless and take years to be self-sufficient. Hanky-panky between humans remained highly important, both for procreation of the species and for bonding between mates. But it became, well, complicated. Humans figuring out how babies were made didn't uncomplicate it any, since men needed to regularly put their lives in front of their children and later support and teach them. Being confident of paternity of offspring is highly important. The primary reason for restrictions about where, when, and who one is allowed to butter biscuits with was very closely related to where and when children were born, and making sure they were born into conditions conducive to raising them. And the secondary reason is to reduce conflict. Humans tend to get kind of cranky when someone they feel romantically attached to starts bumping bellies with another person. It creates issues of fear concerning parentage, abandonment, loss of resources, loss of love, all hugely important. In the biblical world, there is only one situation in which children could be born so that raising them would not be problematic, with the chances of survival rather dim. And that was in an established household with the child having an established place. And the only situation where that was possible was inside of marriage. As a result, the only place where baby-making activities were allowed were a woman with her husband, man with his wives, or a harlot, the sinfulness of prostitution in the Old Testament being somewhat murky. Because of the harshness of this reality, the most spoke of and most harshly condemned lustful sin in the Old Testament is adultery. And punishment was harsh. Both the man caught with the married woman and the woman risked death if caught. While that was a punishment likely threatened more often than applied, a woman caught in flagellata with a man not her husband could expect to be divorced and ejected from the household with no support. She would leave any children she had behind her as they belonged to her husband's family. Her family was also likely to reject her. The consequences were dire. And since there were few options for a woman to earn a living, the prognosis for a child, should she end up pregnant, were even more dire. A girl becoming pregnant prior to marriage faced a similar fate. No longer marriageable, she was likely ejected from her parents' house to raise her child alone with neither the alms nor the respect of a widow. A man caught playing footsie with another man's wife was not off the hook. A lot of anger goes along with that reality. Something that could result in feuding between families, loss of reputation, punishing demands for restitution, and of course, duels to the death, arrest and execution, or just plain flat out murder. My, how the times have changed. Compared to biblical times, the consequences of an ill-planned bedroom rodeo are not likely so dire. A woman alone can realistically expect to raise her kids to adulthood. Divorce does not mean the end of life as we know it, or usually the end of contact with kids. Adultery is not a capital offense. Birth control greatly reduces the chances of an unwelcome pregnancy. Being born to unmarried parents does not damage a person's prospects, and DNA testing can establish paternity with certainty. If a married woman or man wants to have an affair, isn't that her business? If her husband divorces her, it isn't like she won't be able to support herself or that he gets out of helping support the kids. The grandparents are unlikely to reject them either. If he chooses not to divorce her, paternity can be determined with certainty. Not to mention that diligent application of birth control will hugely reduce the chances of an accidental pregnancy. I mean, if both people are of age and consenting, what's the harm? And what business is it of anyone else? It's easy to think that rules about who you are allowed to canoodle with, or in general, the idea of societal imposed limits on consenting adults, are no longer relevant. And legally, you would be right. We've decided as a culture that it is not useful to make a criminal case out of any horseplay between consenting adults. We've chosen to reserve police action for situations we consider more criminal and more important to stop. Specifically, lack of consent, children, and incest. Topics I won't be discussing here because I'm sure we're all in agreement about the wrongness, nor do I need to rail about societal acceptance, as all of these crimes come with harsh punishments, both in court and in cultural reaction. But that does not mean there are no situations between consenting adults where it's wrong, and certainly doesn't mean that it's never a problem. Allow me to illustrate. So I'm going to do it. Yes, I am. I am going to stand in church and tell an off-color joke. So a couple is new in town and being very strong in their faith. They decided they wanted to join a very strict church. They were told by the pastor that in order to join the church, they needed to prove their dedication to their faith by abstaining from marital relations for 3 months. At the end of the 3 months, the couple go to meet the pastor, and he asks them how they did. The husband says, "Well, Father, we were doing very well. I thought we would make it. But just last Thursday, my wife bent over to get a can of beans, and I was overcome by lust, and well, I just nailed her right there." "Well," replies the pastor, "I'm sorry to tell you that you are not welcome in this church." "That's okay, Father," says the husband. "I understand. We're not welcome in Safely either." So clearly, our culture does have rules about where and when it's appropriate to dance the horizontal mambo. The main point of this story, besides the punchline, of course, is that the man was overcome with lust. He made a decision that was sure to damage his life and the life of his wife. They were denied membership in a church they wanted to join. They gained a reputation probably not conducive to future career advancement, and they were not welcome in Safeway. One of the things about lust is that if you allow yourself to walk down that path, there comes a point of no return. There will come a line that when you cross it, it will take drastic outside events to make you stop, such as the wife walks in. There's a story about the Buddha while still a prince. He was making love to his wife and they rolled off the roof into a bunch of lotus and paid no attention until they were finished. Certainly, it's unlikely that one will stop solely in response, this page also left blank, to voices in their head yelling, it's a bad idea. The husband in this tale made the mistake of looking at his wife bent over for a can of beans and allowing his mind to go to a lustful place, only to discover that he was over that line as soon as he allowed the thought. Where that line is far from easily predicted. Different people, different situations will have different results. And even individuals themselves are not likely to predict just when and where that line will come, and thus can end up on the far side of it before they realize it. Realization usually coming after everything is said and done. Mike Pence was ridiculed for saying that he does not eat a meal alone with a woman not his wife. Something he said he does for two reasons. One is that he does not want to ever have the appearance of impropriety that might distress his wife. And the other is that he keeps a large neutral zone around any situation that might lead to lust. Keeping that large neutral zone around any situation where lust could be trouble was mostly how the old world dealt with the consequences of people, particularly young people, succumbing to lust. Men and women who were not allowed to get frisky but might want to, were not allowed to be around each other. We do not run things that way in our world. Men and women as individuals are free to mingle and mostly run their lives as they wish, creating a lot of opportunities for people who shouldn't be messing with each other to be close enough, long enough to want to. While the rules for who and when one is allowed to knock boots in our modern culture are less strict than old times, they're also more complicated. There's actually a lot of situations where getting squiggly with someone is likely to cause trouble in the US today. If one's in a romantic relationship, then most often any diddling outside that relationship is probably eventually going to lead to trouble. But also bosses with subordinates or workplace romances in general, doctors and patients, therapists and clients, or in general, anyone with mental health issues or mental capacity issues, anyone in a position of power with anyone not in that position, any actual breaking of the law, and of course, any time with anyone you decide not to use that protection you knew you should use. If you're contemplating a situation where a hot yoga session is well and good and does not include regrets, you don't need to keep a watch on your desires. That's the time when you get to wallow in your lust, indulge in the contemplation and the anticipation, experience the heightened awareness and intense emotion that make the whole thing wonderful and enhances closeness and bonding. But if there are visible regrets or bad consequences that go along with that horizontal refreshment you're looking at, then you start to walk into danger with that first look. Sure, just like old times, you may cross that line and get away with it. The fling with the boss ended before anyone knew, or the drunken night with the neighbor didn't end in a pink line. Heck, it could even wind up great. The fling with the boss might end up a 45-year marriage, 3 kids and 5 grandkids. That mistake with the neighbor grew up to be the light of your life. If crossing that line with lust was always bad, it probably wouldn't be a problem. People wouldn't be so inclined to do it. But it's a risk, a gamble, an obvious instant reward, and an uncertain chance of getting bit. We all have our own levels of acceptable risk, usually pretty consistent across all categories of our lives. So what do we do about it? We accept that it's true that whatever feels good is not always good. And if it's a situation that you should leave alone, then don't test the edges of the fire. It's a big problem with lust that it leads to physical intimacy. Because anytime you're getting close to diddling, you're gambling with hearts and with lives. And it is damage to those hearts and lives that can turn a healthy, wonderful, even praised by the Bible and Jesus feeling into sin. Thank you. And now if we can have a couple of volunteers for ushers.